And Tom's here as well. Good luck.
Good day, colleagues. Good to see all of you. Welcome back. Welcome to the session. I see Sandor's with us. Desi, welcome. Santiago, Othman, great to see you. Looking forward to a good discussion today. We're going to get started shortly. We'll give it another minute or so for others to join us. Great to have you with us. We are, of course, today doing a recap session. The exciting thing is that you have made it halfway through the program. And so it's a good moment for us to pause and reflect back, focus in on some of the models we looked at, some of the frameworks or the concepts, and make sure that we're all comfortable and ready to apply those in the context of our own work or in the context of our own experiments. Let me quickly put this next slide up here. As you can see here, theory session module 1 part B. We're looking at foresight for everyday practice. I think that should be part D, actually. Looking at foresight for everyday practice, really looking at how we apply these tools, methods, and ideas in the context of our work. Now, before we jump into the content and begin to discuss that, let me ask you to put something in the chat. Today is going to be quite an interactive session. So if you have questions, if I cover anything that you'd like to clarify, please do that today. And we're going to use the chat a lot for that. And so let me ask you this question in the chat. If you had to write one word to describe the way the program, how you've experienced the program so far, what you've learned about foresight, how you felt learning about foresight, where you are in the process, what would the one word be that you would describe your learning experience so far? Don't overthink it. It really is a top of mind question. How have you felt along the way? What have you been going through? Thank you, Delphine, for putting the question there in the chat. Share one word to describe your learning experience so far. Thank you, Tamara, saying rich. It's been a rich learning experience. Interesting. What other words can we come up with to describe our learning experience? Who would like to go for? Louisa, picking up on a very specific one, actually, an S-curve. Yes. We did learn about S-curves, and in some ways, you're going up an S-curve with the learning process. So thank you for picking that up. Sandor says, enlightening. Glad you're enjoying it, Sandor. Elias, extensive, thought-provoking. Oh, Michael, you're breaking the rules a little bit there, going for 2 words, but we'll forgive you for that. Thought-provoking and fire there, very creative with the hyphen, thought-provoking. So I'm hoping that you have some questions today, things that we can clarify about some of the concepts and the tools we've learned. And so let's start by taking a look at where we are in the overall journey. You'll notice that I have on the screen there your overall learning journey. You'll see there that we're indicating in the red bubble where we are. We're in part D, looking at foresight for everyday practice. And we're going to be looking today at some examples of foresight projects that have already taken place, or foresight experiments, as we like to call them in the context of this program. And what we're going to do for the first half of our time together, for the first hour, is we're going to recap part A, B, and C for module 1 and 2. We're going to get familiar again with the tools and some of the methods we looked at. And then in the second hour of our session, we have some special guest speakers coming in to share with us real-world examples of the foresight work that they've done. And what we'll do is we'll pause with those examples and look back and say, well, what are the tools that they used? What methods did they use? How did they think about participation with their foresight project? And what can we learn from that in the context of our own experiment? And so you might be thinking about your own foresight work, about how you might use the foresight work in the context of your own practice, in your division in the UN, or in the work that you do with a partner in the UN network or the UN system. And so hopefully from today's session, you'll take out some really practical insights about how to make that work real in the context of your own work. Now, I want to point you to the language on the slide in the bold text. Specifically, if you look down the list, part A, B, and C in the various modules, you'll notice that we've added some words there in the brackets, talking about the 4 stages or the triangle and pace layers. In part C, under module 1, we speak there in the brackets in bold about the scoping circle and framing. We also spoke in part A of module B about scanning. Remember, we did some scanning together and you came up with scanning hits. We also spoke about, in part B, we spoke about systems thinking. In part C, we spoke about scenarios and causal layered analysis. And so what I'm inviting you to do, if you have any questions today about any of those, as I go through them, I'm inviting you to interrupt me, put up a hand, put a question in the chat. And today really is an opportunity for us to pause and spend some time discussing them. In the other learning sessions, we've had lots of presentation time and some discussion time, but really today is an opportunity to pause and discuss any of those methods, any of those tools, and really make sure that you're comfortable, that you understand what we mean by them. So let me take them one by one, and then we can pause on them as we need. The most important one in some ways is this 4-stage process that we've revisited many times by now in the context of the training. Now, if you were in a training and you were learning how to be an automobile mechanic, what might happen is the trainer might start by telling you about an automobile as a whole and say, this is a whole automobile from the bumper in the front to the bumper at the back and the wheels and the steering wheel and the engine. Before we get down into the nitty-gritties of a single part of the vehicle, we might want to understand the vehicle as a whole, as an entire unit. And so the 4-stage process that we use in SWAF is a very powerful frame or a scaffold to understand the overall process of doing Foresight work. A little bit later, I'm going to share an example of a Foresight project, and I'll talk to you about the overall process that we went through to create that. It is a project that was about Africa energy, the future of energy in Africa, the future of utilities, and it is a project that we did by invitation from an organization called the Africa Utilities Week, and so they were the client. And so if you look at the 4 stages, we scoped that project with them. We then did some ordering, which is the research component of the project. We then investigated implications, which of course is that research part where you're looking at the implications on a project. And then the integration, we then took that project and made it practical with them, with their stakeholders, so that they get the benefit of the foresight coming out of that. And so it's for that reason that we love to give you the scaffold for you to structure a foresight intervention. We spent some time recently with UNDESA, for instance, of course, as a part of the UN system, where they're talking about how do we scope a foresight project with the national government to do national planning? What would the tools be that we would use to research national planning? And then how would we make that live long-term in that institution, in that national government? How would we integrate those insights? Now, the other tool we showed you as part of that conversation about the 4 stages was this idea that in a foresight process, there are two parts to that. There's the divergent phase, where things are getting increasingly complex and you're getting deeper and deeper into the trends and the drivers and the research about the future. And then there's the convergent phase, where things are becoming more and more focused and where you're taking the insights and you're making them practically applicable in the institution or on the project where your foresight is being done. Now, it's important to say, in teaching you foresight, we are right in the middle of this divergent, convergent process right now. We've taught you about the foundations of foresight. We've taught you about the methods that are used in foresight. We've taught you essentially scoping and ordering, but we still have to get into investigating and integrating futures. We haven't gotten into that yet. And so if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, where, wow, it's been extensive, as Elias says, it's been enlightening, but maybe you have some unanswered questions, we have lots of time still in the program to answer those questions and to move towards that convergent phase in the process of the learning. Now, let me start by going into the 4 stages And like I said, we're going to touch on each of those tools that we've covered in the process. So first of all, we spoke about scoping, which is really understanding the purpose, audience, and design of the project. To really understand scoping, and I'm revisiting some of the slides you've seen, we have to ask ourselves, why is the client or the partner that we're working with, why are they doing Foresight? What is it that they're trying to achieve? Are they trying to challenge their assumptions? So maybe they assumed, if you're working in energy, for instance, in Europe, maybe you assumed that you are going to get energy security through a pipeline from Russia. And all of a sudden, the energy market is up in flux. Now you have to make new assumptions about where do you get energy from. Germany meeting with Qatar, for instance, to talk about natural gas. And so scenarios can help you to challenge your assumptions and explore the alternative possibilities. They can, futures can help you to avoid surprises or threats. Maybe as the UN, you're realizing that there is artificial intelligence and there's the internet and there's virtual working. And so the question might be, what does a virtual UN look like? What happens to the infrastructure of an organization when many different parts of its activities become virtual? And so that can be an opportunity, a surprise, a threat. It can challenge you in many different ways. Or you might want to generate new opportunities, new options for your organization or for your partner organization. You might want to extend your time horizon. So for instance, let's say the Minister of Education in a country is planning in education for the next 10 years, but you realize that to have technology in your country as a competence, you need to plan for the next 50 years to say, what is the infrastructure that the education sector needs? And so by doing Foresight, you can extend the time horizon with which the policymakers or strategists think about the issue that they're doing Foresight on, or you might want to anticipate and shape the future. You might want to influence the future of a particular sector, or you might want to align an organization. Let's say, for instance, you have let's imagine a nation state consisting of 15 islands, or in the case of what is it? What's the country called? It'll come back to me now, which has hundreds of islands that make up Indonesia, which consists of hundreds of islands. And you say, well, how do we unite and align the people across Indonesia about the future of Indonesia? Well, you could run a Foresight process at national level to align the citizens of Indonesia about the future of their country, right? And so aligning your organization or aligning your community or aligning an entire country, you could use Foresight for that purpose. And by the way, very interestingly, the common agenda inside of the United Nations is at some level an exercise in Foresight. It's an exercise in understanding the state of the world, understanding the future of the world, and creating a common agenda so that the countries around the world can work on that shared agenda together. So scoping, which is what we were speaking about in this earlier slide, is really about understanding what you are trying to do with the Foresight that you're doing. And the way we do that is two different tools that we shared with you. The one is the scoping note. I won't go through it again. You've seen it many times. The other one is the framing tool, which the experiment framing template, which the UNGP is in the process of developing. And using those two tools, you are really able to scope the project to really understand the purpose, the audience, and how to engage them. Now, why is this so crucially important? Why do we say as SWAF that you should be spending a significant amount of time scoping as part of a Foresight process? The quote that we love concerning this is by Adrienne Marie Brown, who says the following: "There is a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. Find it." When you understand that Foresight is a social learning process, the process of bringing people together to engage in conversations about the future is itself a social learning process. By spending time together, in fact, there's a very interesting study on this, where if you take a human being and you look at all the knowledge they have, some of the knowledge they have is what we call codified knowledge. They know that knowledge. But some of the knowledge they have is around them, they refer to this as it's in the zone of proximal development. In other words, that human being knows something, but they don't know that they know that. It's a little bit like a 2-year-old child who picks up a teacup and puts their finger in the air and drinks from the teacup and pretends to pour tea for their friend. They're 2 years old. They know how to pour tea because they've seen their parents do that, but they don't know that they know how to pour tea. The tea pouring is in the zone of proximal development. Now, what happens with human beings when they talk to each other and they have social interaction, they codify the knowledge that they have. It's called socialization. It's a very technical term, but what it means is when you do foresight with people, you are turning the knowledge in the proximal development into codified knowledge. In other words, I know that artificial intelligence is going to shape the way my children are educated in the next 10 years, but I don't know that I know that. And the technologist who's using artificial intelligence in education knows things about that. And the ethicist who talks about what is the role of AI in education and what are the ethics of that knows certain things. And by talking to each other, we can create a picture of the future of artificial intelligence in education. And so, as Marianne Brown says, there's a conversation in the room that only these people can have at this time. And we say it's a conversation about the future. Foresight is about finding that conversation and facilitating that conversation. This is why we do foresight on intergenerational fairness, for instance, because we're enabling the policymakers and the youth and the business community and the government to come together and have a conversation about the future. Now, that's why scoping is so important, because what scoping does is it helps us understand the purpose of the foresight. It then helps us understand the audience we're trying to engage. It helps us understand the what. In other words, what is the focal question this audience wants to work on? Do they want to work on the future of education? Do they want to work on the future of gender inclusion? Or do they want to work on the future of gender? What is the future of gender in a world where AI robots will live among us in 2050, for instance? Will there be gendered robots? And what does that mean? Is there such a thing as a gendered chatbot? These are the kinds of questions that we can ask with foresight. What is the focal question? Is it clear? Do we have agreement about the focal question? It also allows us to think deeply about the way we design foresight. In other words, which aspects of our foresight do we do with conventional methods like scenario planning or forecasting? Which aspect of our foresight work do we need to develop new participative methods to do? And then very importantly, it allows us to be intentional about the sensing network that we are going to use in our foresight. In other words, if we want to have a conversation about the future of AI in education, who needs to be in the room? In other words, who needs to be in that conversation? What is the sensing network that would help us have that conversation in an effective way? Now, I've spoken again about scoping. I know you've covered this ground before, but before I go to the next step, which is scanning, or which is part of ordering, let me pause on scoping. I'm sure you've got questions. Who would like to raise a hand or take the floor, pop a question in the chat? When it comes to scoping, maybe you have an observation or a comment. Who would like to add something or ask something? Please go ahead. You might want to be thinking about scoping your own foresight experiment. Who are you going to talk to? Who's the audience? What's the purpose of the project? Any questions or comments relating to scoping? I don't see any coming up. Please interrupt me if you have any, or pop a question in the chat or a comment. If you have an observation, please pop that in the chat. And so if there is none, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to scanning. Now, of course, once we've done the scoping, which is the first step in a foresight process, the next step in the foresight process is to go to scanning. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that we did a foresight process looking at the future of energy. I mentioned to you that this, in fact, I'm going to change screens for a second and share with you the cover of that project. And we can look at that project in a little bit of detail to get a real understanding of how to practically apply foresight. And so what you'll see here is this was the project we did. It was on the future of energy and power utilities in Africa. And it was done for this organization called the Africa Utilities Week. What happened in that situation was they run an annual continent-wide conference on the future of energy. And they came to us and they said, we want to engage the leaders of the power utilities across Africa in a conversation about the future of energy. Is the future of energy coal? Is it nuclear? Is it oil and gas? What's the future of energy in Africa? How do we unlock that future? And so they wanted us to do a keynote speech to the audience. And we said to them, instead of doing a keynote speech, which is one person talking, why don't we do a Foresight project looking at the future of energy and power utilities in Africa? In other words, why don't we do a study of the future of energy, but we do the study in a participative way with the energy utilities, with the experts in the region. And then when we have the conference, what we do at the conference is we have a strategic dialogue with the CEOs of the power utilities. And we say to them, this is what the research shows is the future of energy. What do you think is the future of energy? And so we got together in a room with, I think it was 22 CEOs of power utilities, and we had a facilitated strategic dialogue on the basis of the research that we had done. Now, I'm going to, as we go through our teaching today, I'm going to take you step by step through the report that came from that project and show you how that report was built and the process that we went through to do that. Now, you'll notice before we go into that, that the structure of the report is quite important, because what the structure does is it mirrors the 4-stage process, or it mirrors the way you do a Foresight experiment. It starts with an executive summary, which of course is the summary of what everything that came out of the report. But what it then has is it has the scenarios, number 3, the trends, a discussion of the trends. You could put in there drivers, the drivers of the trend. And then it has the political context, the trends by category, the research design. So actually, if when you read the report, you read it from 1 to 10. But when we built the Foresight project, the Foresight experiment, we built it from 10 all the way up to 1. In other words, you'll see there the appendix, the scanning frameworks, the Delphi survey, the research design, the trends by category. In other words, the summary, the report reports on the project once it's complete, but really it was built step by step from 10 to 9 to 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4, all the way to that executive summary, which is what the audience eventually engaged with. And what we'll do as we go through our session today is we'll visit those different sections and get an understanding of how it is that we created that Foresight process. Now, the first step, once you've done the scoping with your client organization, once you understand why you're doing the Foresight, the next step is to begin the ordering process. And usually when we do the ordering process, that will consist of what we call scanning. Now, we've spoken about scanning before. We scan for drivers and signals of change. What does that look like? Very, very often in a Foresight process, you'll see a process that looks a little bit like this. Now, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it. If the most important thing you took from today was this basic overview, that would be already, and you'll get 90% of what you need to get from today's session. Once you understand that inside of the ordering process of a scoping, ordering, implications process is this core set of ideas. The first is that we can scan for change by looking at trends. Once we've identified the trends, we can look at the drivers of those trends. In other words, to understand where does that change come from? What's driving the change? We can then look at the system. How do those drivers interact to create a system? And we can then look at alternative futures. Now, when we spoke about alternative futures, sorry about my slides jumping around, I accidentally did that. When we spoke about alternative futures, we spoke about causal layered analysis, but you can also talk about scenarios. And we're going to go through that in a little bit of detail to understand how this process works of ordering, going from trends, drivers, systems, and alternative futures to really understand that. Of course, when we talk about trends and drivers, we did in our session with Peter Glenday get quite detailed on that. We spoke about weak signals, and trends and drivers of change. And we also spoke about wildcards, unexpected events that can have high impacts on the way things are and create radical, drastic change, which could be quite unexpected. And we spoke about looking at these within the context of where we are, not ourselves as an organization, as a system, or our operating environment, but in our contextual environment, really scanning for them in the contextual environment. And we spoke about how we would organize ourselves to do that well by using something like STEEP, by using a social, technological, and others, and how we would then do a Foresight project on the basis of that. Now, if I go back for a minute to the project we spoke about, the one I showed you, and I speak about how we did that in the context of this project. So, of course, we were looking at the future of energy, and we had structured the project in a very particular way. So how did we go about scanning for this project? Well, the first thing we did, and I'm going right to the bottom of the project, the first thing we did is we developed a STEEP framework. You'll notice that little image there. If you look carefully inside of that image, you'll notice that it's got STEEP hidden in there. It's a little bit organized a bit differently. It's got political, economic, social, technological, ecological. It's then got a geopolitical component. It then looks at infrastructure and other structures. We had quite an elaborate scanning framework, but we realized because we're looking at energy, which is complex, it won't be enough just to use STEEP. So we developed an additional framework that specifically looks at scanning in the context of cities, because energy in Africa is largely in cities. It's called the urban grid, the energy grid. So we developed a framework that looks like this. It's the political, economic, and social triangle, upside down triangle, looking at the components of urban governance, the governance of cities, national government, provincial government or local government, from social housing. So we had quite an elaborate scanning framework. And what we then did is we used that scanning framework, and I'm not going to read the report because it's a lengthy, detailed report, but I'll give you a touch of how that worked. And so using that framework, we looked at the different issues within that environment. We looked at the trends, and you can see here the trends by energy sources, hydro, in different parts of the thermal. So these are different sources of energy. We looked at geothermal energy. And so I could go through the detail of that. We looked at hundreds and hundreds of trends and drivers using a team of researchers. And you can, if you read the report, you will see that we summarize those trends, everything from public debt to economic growth in the regions, to understand those trends. Now, if I go back to the summary of that report, you'll see there that at the bottom of that list, the scanning frameworks, and we use the tool called the Delphi study, informed, number 7, the trends that we were looking at. And so there's a real practical example of how we used STEEP, but we made it more sophisticated, more complex, because we were dealing with a complex problem. And we were looking at the changes in the environment of energy in that particular project. Now, when you do that, we also shared with you that you can look at different sources of information. Some of the sources are about information that's only just emerging. So in other words, leading edge consumers, radicals, and scientists in energy who are at the cutting edge of energy fusion, or at the cutting edge of hydrogen energy, or at the bottom of the curve, like the curve will increase. Once you start reading newspapers and you start reading legal documents of government, you're talking about the mainstream. So in the heart of that curve, the bulk in the middle there is the mainstream. These are things we've known for a long time. But by looking at the margins, the early signals, you start to get information about how that domain is changing. And you'll notice that as the issue evolves, there's a point at which it declines, where it gets resolved, but that particular issue might create a new set of issues, and then it starts looking a lot like an S-curve, like one of you said earlier. And so that is a little bit about scanning. Michael asks, is the report available? Yes, a little bit later we'll share the link, not yet, but a little bit later today we'll share the example of the report, and you can have a look at it to see how a Foresight experiment can be structured and what its outputs might look like. Now, I want to pause there before we look at the effects of the trends and the drivers, and get into a conversation about systems thinking, let me ask, are there any questions or comments about S-curves, about steep, about the contextual environment, about wildcards or trends, anything relating to scanning that's on your mind that you would like to ask? Of course, it's as much an art as a science. And the more you do it, the more experience you get. What are your questions or comments relating to scanning and how to do it well? Or maybe you have a particular experiment where you are thinking of scanning and you haven't quite figured out how to do it. What do you have in mind? What questions or comments would you like to share? And of course, the chat is available for those of you who have a question. And please don't be shy to ask a question. There's no such thing as a silly question. If you have that question in mind, there'll definitely be others who have the same question that you're grappling with. Let me pause there. Who'd like to ask a question or pose a comment? It always takes one participant to break the ice.
Marius, I just want to check, can you see the chat?
Johan, I can now. I've just switched it on. Thank you for that.
Great. There's two questions.
Perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. So Vivian has a question, and Minji, thank you for that. So Vivian's question, how long did it take you to complete the whole exercise on Africa Energy? Vivian, I'm going to tell you how long it took us for that project, but then I'm going to give you a broader comment about how long does Foresight take, right? So for that project, we had about 6 months between when they invited us to speak at the conference versus us doing the research. Took about 2.5 months, producing a preliminary report, circulating that report to the stakeholders, because by doing a participative study, the audience became participants. The audience of the Foresight research became participants in the Foresight research. We circulated it to them about a month before the event. We then had the engagement at the event where we had a dialogue about what the report was saying. We then produced a subsequent updated report with their inputs. And then I think about a year later, we received an invitation from the Minister of Energy in South Africa to address the exco of the energy utility, their board, in fact, to address them about the future of energy. So if you looked at that, it probably took about a year from inception to impact in terms of in the public environment in South Africa where I live. And so it is possible. I've had, last week, in fact, I had a client who is a corporate who needed to do Foresight as part of a strategy week. And they phoned me up and said, we've got 2 days, Monday, Tuesday, come and help us do some Foresight. Now, so what am I saying? You can do Foresight in 2 days, but I appreciate then it's much more shallow, much more limited. And the conversation you're hosting is really a short-term, real-time conversation about a strategy versus Foresight that can take a year or 2 years. I once sat in a session at the Oxford Said Business School where there was a researcher who was looking at the future of transport in Europe. It was a 2-year study as part of a 5-year PhD, where he was looking at the future of trains, the future of airplanes, the future of hyperlinks, the future of micro-mobility in cities. And he was getting the stakeholders from across Europe to meet at Oxford for a dialogue, one sector at a time. And over a process of 2 years, he was writing up his research in order to talk about in his PhD about the future of transport. So it could take years depending on what you're trying to do and the size of the stakeholder network. The other question from Minji, thank you for that question, Vivian, was how do you identify whether the scanning has been done well? Well, Minji, this is where the question is more of an art than a science. There are certain obvious principles. So for instance, if I put up, in fact, let me take you back to the slide on steep. If I put up this slide on steep and I say, we've done the scanning, the question would be, have we scanned comprehensively? In other words, do we have scanning outputs for every one of the steep categories? If we've done the scanning, but we haven't looked at technology or politics, we would have missed something. Now, depending on what you are doing this about, so if I'm doing Foresight about terrorist groups in rural areas in Mali. And some of the terrorist groups are connected to religious groups, but some of the terrorist members who are connected to religious groups are also youths coming from poor families. Then I can't just look at the politics of Mali. I would have to look at the community dynamics. I'd have to look at the migration in Mali between pastoralists and nomadic tribes. I'd have to look at the employment levels of youths in vulnerable communities to understand the future of terrorism in Mali. So this is why when we talk about scoping, we also refer to framing, because by framing that piece of foresight work right, it's going to inform your scanning exercise. And so in scanning, you might add, as you see there in that black text, you might add legal components, you might add humanitarian components, you might add values, you might scan for very specific things relating to the future of that issue. And so to come back to your question, how do we know it's been done well? First of all, has it been done comprehensively? Second of all, when you've scanned, were you looking for information in the right place? In other words, it's not enough to quote the Institute for Security Studies in Europe writing about Mali. You may also have to talk to the NGOs operating in Mali. You may have to talk to religious leaders on the ground, in communities, in a place like Mali, to get the real granular understanding of the emerging issues. So when I meet with a telco cell phone infrastructure provider, and they tell me that their cost for putting up cell phone towers in the Sahel region is increasing, and I say to them, why is the cost for telecom towers in Sahel increasing? And they tell me, because the people are, on the one hand, people steal the batteries from the towers, and on the other hand, terrorist groups will destroy the towers as part of preventing the proliferation of Western education. Now, that's a scan hit from a technology company about infrastructure, but it tells a story about the nature of terrorism in that region. And so doing it well is an art and a science, but there are some practical things. Is it comprehensive? Are your sources the right kind of sources that will give you the signals? And this brings me back to this slide. Are you picking up the weak signals? Are you picking up the trends? Do you understand the drivers of change? Have you anticipated the wildcards or the shocks that could emerge? And those would require different sources of scanning. Thank you for the great question. I see Tamara saying, good example from Africa Utilities. Don't you find you always have to modify scanning, including some element, expanding it to make it relevant? Tamara, you're echoing exactly what I'm sharing. Thank you for doing that. And then Fire says, how do you ensure that scanning isn't biased in your own knowledge or expertise? This is a very important one. When you're doing scanning and you're planning your scanning, there's a rhyme there, right? What your scanning framework actually is a reflection of your own mental model. So in other words, when you plan to scan, you are putting your mental model onto the page. Now, the very important thing is that the group who is doing the scanning planning, the framing, that group should be diverse. In other words, if a wealthy person from a developed country goes into an underdeveloped country in the rural area to scan, they will probably look for the formal economy and the formal institutions and the formal infrastructure. Because if you live in a very developed country like Japan, it's run by the formal economy, the formal institutions, and the formal infrastructure. But if you're in a poor country somewhere in Southeast Asia, an underdeveloped country, then the country very often is run by the informal institutions, the informal infrastructure, and the informal economy. And so by having the diversity in the room of different people from different social classes, different race groups, different cultural experiences, different technical backgrounds, you might have a political scientist and a sociologist and an artist or a musician. That diversity ensures that you counter for those biases, which you're 100% right, they very often are there. And we have to reflect, we have to critically reflect what could be biased about what we're doing. Claudia asks, what are your recommendations about scanning under values? the values category? What is the criteria and analysis? How do we separate them from other categories? So Claudia, an interesting one, you were once invited to do some foresight in India, looking at conflict between religious and race groups on the basis of religion. It was a concern about rising Hindu nationalism, rising Muslim discontent, and the rise of Christian minorities operating in NGOs, and the conflict between these different groups. Now, when you start looking at scanning at the anthropological level, the human level, or the cultural level, then you need to start looking at things like values, norms, stories. This is where causal layered analysis that gets into the worldview or the myth is so powerful, because you can ask, does the society value individualism or collectivism? Does the society value competition or collaboration? And they are, we don't get into a whole session on that now, but by looking at things like the World Values Survey, you can look at what the core values are around the world and where different individuals sit on that spectrum in terms of their culture. What is that culture's norms? We did some work on the future of Afghanistan, for instance, looking at conflict and the role of education among girls in a post-conflict Afghanistan. You have to look at all kinds of sociological factors that contribute to a person's socialization. And so there's a whole conversation there about how do we create a framework for that kind of work? It's a great question. Michael says, as you do it effectively, completely via discussions on a virtual platform. Are you asking the question, and we do that? So Michael, we do a combination of in-person dialogues and virtual dialogues. In one of the projects we did, we took a quantitative model to look at the future of Africa. We then created qualitative dialogues on Zoom with people from 20 countries in those dialogues, where we brought the qualitative and the quantitative in line with each other to explore possibilities. And then we had an in-person dialogue to talk about the preliminary report that came from that. So you can use a combination. And this is really where the design of your Foresight project becomes so important. I want to pause here before I go into the rest of my slides and ask my colleague Johan, who's been listening in, who's widely experienced on doing some of these kinds of projects. Do you have any reflections, Johan, 2 or 3 thoughts as you've listened to the conversation? I see you put some things in chat. What would you add? What would you contribute?
I think most of all for me, and this illustrates also what we will be doing in the next hour, is really that in terms of how we design the experiment really links with the question. And that to me is why the scoping question is so important, because that frames a little bit of the scanning as well, in terms of guiding us to some extent as to where we need to go scanning and what we need to really look for to sort of answer our question. And then there's also a good combination always between expert conversations, and Morris touched upon that, but a couple of methods, for instance, which we often use are the seven questions that was originally designed by Shell. And that's also usually a very useful scanning tool, if you will, having these expert questions with people within the organization, but also outside of the organization. And the questions usually focus on sort of their hopes and fears, and also decisions they think needs to be done now or not. And, and going through that process and maybe interviewing 4 or 5 people from different perspectives really helps with the scanning and framing in terms of what the main issues of a project or a problem really is. And yeah, I think that's it for now. Thank you, Morris.
Thank you, Johan. Very interesting. Colleagues, let me say that we're going to show you shortly a number of different Foresight approaches. We made the point early on by saying that SWOF is method agnostic. In other words, we come to a Foresight project, and I had a balloon pop in my office, I apologize. We come to a Foresight project with the view that the client's need should guide our design. And that cuts across things like participation, information, how do we communicate, is all informed by what we're trying to do with that client. Now, let me take you back to the slides because there are a couple of things more to cover. The one is that once we've done the scanning, the challenge often is how do we make sense of that scanning? How do you put your thinking cap on and understand what all of this new information means? And that is really where systems thinking comes in. And there are other ways of doing this, but it's about understanding the effects of that scanning. And so we might use different tools. We might use a futures wheel where we put a trend at the center and we think about the first order, second order, third order implications. So here's a crazy example to make the point. Let's say that in July of this year, we discover that there are aliens, that all of a sudden humans wake up and realize there are aliens around the world. That will have first order implications on religion. It will have implications on space travel. It will have implications on the definition of what it means to be a human, if there's a species out there among us in the planet, right? And that will have second order implications. And so you could take an issue, and I'm using a memorable one to give the example, but any issue could have second order, third order implications. But not only do they have second order, third order implications, those implications have interconnections with each other. And this is where systems thinking allows us to find the interconnections in the systems that we're looking at. And so in the UN, for instance, we talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but they're quite linear. But actually the SDGs are connected to each other in a system of how they all influence each other. If you increase education levels, you decrease poverty, because increasing education raises economic growth, which decreases poverty, but that might also increase inequality. And so these things are interconnected. Now, in an actual Foresight project, like the one I was telling you about, we used systems thinking to think about how the different trends, of which there were many, are interconnected. And I'll quickly show you what the system looked like. Once we had scanned the energy environment, we then created a systems diagram. Now, this is a very complex one. You don't have to create complex ones. You can create simple ones, but you can see there on that systems diagram that on the left-hand side, you have the political and governance environment. On the bottom left, you have the technology development. On the top right, you have the global economic environment. On the bottom right, you have the socio-economic environment, and a number of factors in the political and economic and social environment are interacting to create a set of outcomes for the future of energy. And what we would do is we analyze the system and we figure out where are the leverage points that will change the system, or where are the key dependencies that determine the outcome of the system. Now, if you're not a systems analyst, that's fine. You can hire someone to work with you as a partner, or create a partnership with an organization that is an expert in systems thinking. And then you may or may not, you might choose not to use systems thinking. We tend to use it because we work in complex systems. And so when you're doing systems thinking, you're thinking about the patterns of change. Is the issue going up the S-curve from framing to advancing to resolving? Is the issue moving around the panarchy when multiple systems are interacting? Some of the systems are becoming conservative, they're aging. Some of the systems are in crisis. Some of the systems are reorganizing themselves. And some of the systems are open for exploitation and exploration. And what you're doing as you're moving through that process is you're looking at different aspects of Bronfenbrenner's multiple systems, the ecology of systems, microsystems, mesosystems, exosystems, all the way through to chronosystems. How are these systems interacting? And that is really helping you think about the future of that issue. Now, there's a great Foresight expert called Hodgson, which developed a tool, you heard about it in the training, called the world model. What did he do? He used systems thinking to connect a number of different domains, the cultural domain, the food domain, the water domain, and to think about how they changed. And then, of course, we mentioned to you that it's very important to note that these systems are in transition. In Horizon 1, in this 3 horizons model, the first system is dominant. At the moment in the world, the Bretton Woods system is dominant. It's Horizon 1. Before Bretton Woods, the system of the League of Nations and the gold standard used to dominate. If you took those three horizons and you said, Bretton Woods is the blue line, Bretton Woods is the second horizon. Before Bretton Woods was the gold standard and the League of Nations. What is the third horizon? Does Bretton Woods extend and dominate for another 50 years? Or does Bretton Woods evolve and get replaced by a new cryptocurrency standard? You could explore the future of the global order, the world order, the financial system, or these kinds of things using systems thinking. Very importantly, systems thinking is built on very simple causal loop diagrams. If this element affects that element, or factor affects that factor, it's either in reinforcing it or it's resisting it. And you can create these different loops to think about these things. Here's another example of a systems diagram we did looking at the future of energy in Angola with an energy organization, and the way that the economy and the oil price impacts political stability. And then very importantly, you can, of course, use quantitative systems. We heard last week from Tanya from the Pardee Center at the University of Denver, where they have a quantitative model that uses systems thinking to create alternative futures for countries at a global level. So you can use quantitative ones. And then once you've analyzed your drivers of change using different models, methods like systems thinking, then the question is, how do you tell that story? Well, the simple way to do it is to synthesize that insight into stories. We call them scenarios. Last week, we looked at the Atlantic Council scenarios of a post-COVID world. Scenarios are really stories about the future. Story 1, great acceleration. Story 2, China first. Story 3, the new renaissance. And another example of a scenario is the limits to growth, which was a story told in the 1970s about how the earth reaches the limits to growth, to capitalist consumption. Today, we learn about the donut economics from that great author of the book, Donut Economics, and we learn about planetary boundaries. Well, it turns out that the limits to growth story told in 1970 was a pretty compelling, pretty accurate story. And so scenarios help us understand the way in which those different futures converge to materialize. There are different ways of doing scenarios. There's not just a single way. The one I've shown you is a particular method, but there are technical scenarios that are very structured. And then there are values-based scenarios that are very intuitive. It's like like Claudia's question. How do you deal with values? Well, if you're doing foresight based on culture and values and worldviews, you typically would do scenarios that are very values-based. So here's an example. I was doing a talk to an organization last week, in fact, about the future of artificial intelligence. And so I said to them, where are you in 50 years? Are you in 50 years a digital nomad, which means you are spending half your time in virtual reality with artificial intelligence using a smart device, and you're spending half your time in the real world, the physical world? So you're a digital nomad? Or do you live in 2050 in a blended family where your spouse is an artificial intelligence android, or one of your children that you are raising as a person is a digital nomad, is a digital humanoid robot that's got artificial intelligence that maybe has been programmed on the basis of your family values? Or are you in a world where you've had a brain implant and you are fully immersed, a little bit like the Matrix, like Elon Musk's brain shunt that he's building through one of his companies? Are you a fully immersed artificial intelligent transhumanist? Now that story provokes all kinds of feelings about values and intuition about what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to love in an artificial intelligence future, right? And so you can build all kinds of different scenarios using different methods. We did share with you the 2x2 method, causal layered analysis, morphological, archetypal scenarios, pathways, and then one called the Manoa method. And they are all good for different purposes. And so you might have questions about which method do I use? Well, let's do some scoping and we can figure out which method to use. Archetypal scenarios typically are about growth, transformation, discipline, or collapse. And then, of course, we dealt with causal layered analysis. So Hale Iatula's approach, which looks at the litany, the systems, the worldviews, and the metaphors in order to explore alternative futures. Now, we have 5 minutes left before we break for a 5-minute break, and we talk about putting it all together. Let me stop sharing my screen and check. What are your questions? What are your comments? We've spoken about scoping, ordering, scanning, systems thinking, and scenarios. Any questions that you'd like us to cover as we pause there? Any comments that you'd like to share? So I don't see any hands go up. With that, colleagues, I'm going to invite you to continue to put your questions in the chat. Very importantly, after our 5-minute break, we are coming back to 3 guest speakers, which we're very excited about. And they're going to share with us how they use Foresight in their projects. And we'll have an opportunity to reflect on the design choices that they made based on their Foresight project's purpose. It's now 4 minutes to the hour. Could I suggest we take a 5-minute break and we reconvene at 2 minutes past the hour? Looking forward to seeing you in 5 minutes. See you soon.
Great, thanks. So hello, everybody, from my end, and we will start and continue with the next part of this hour. Our focus now is really to, Marius took us through the process until the end of module 2, which brings us to scenarios, etc. But what we want to do in this next hour is we really want to share with you some examples of projects or experiments in terms of people we know, etc. And we really try to get a diverse group of examples and Foresight practitioners together for this hour. The important thing here is that Foresight, we design a Foresight experiment obviously for a specific purpose or a specific question. And so we can draw from many methods that are fit for purpose in terms of the design and how we answer that project question. So each Foresight experiment literally looks different depending on what the purpose is, the question, how it's being designed, and what are the methods that are being pulled into this design. So the purpose now is to share with you these examples. And then after that, we will have a discussion on the design and the way the different methods have been used or pulled into the experiments. So our agenda for the next hour will be as follows. We're a bit 4 minutes behind, but we'll make up in the discussion at the end. We have Tom Wambeki. I'll introduce him in a minute. And then we've got Daria Versailles and Alina Roldan and then Pupil Bisht. And then after that, we will have a conversation. So with that, I'm just quickly introducing Tom Wambeki. He will be, he's from ITC ILO, and he's the chief of learning and innovation. And not only are they supporting us in this project or in this program, and helping us with house space, etc. But they also developed the Foresight Toolkit, and they will be sharing some of their very own interesting projects they've done before. So with that, Tom, I'm handing over to you. Welcome, and I think I'll stop screen sharing and hand over to you. So you're welcome to share your screen. Okay, thanks a lot, Johan. And Mary as well. I'm trying to share my screen. Let me just click on it. Great. Just double checking if you are able to see my screen, yes. Because my own back screen got a little bit reversed. So that was my own personal wild card of today, just as the balloon popping up of Marius. These things can happen in Foresight webinars. So dear all, nice to meet you here. As Johan rightly said, we're working behind the screens to support this 4 times 4 systems change course, but also actively busy in the International Training Center of the ILO with really integrating Foresight in all what
we do in our projects, in our training, as, let's say, co-creation and collaborative foresight methods to use it in facilitation. And what I wanted to do in the next 8 minutes was basically pitching a few of the ideas that represent our foresight journey, which basically started, I think, 7-8 years ago. Like it happens in a lot of organizations. Why do one start? It's the kind of curiosity that pops up with a few individuals that are very passionate about foresight, including myself, which I would quote it as the kind of unreadable Stephen Hawking quote of intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. And for us, it was also a way to basically deal with the change that was happening here at the training center. But not only that, because we all work in organizations, institutions that are sometimes relatively slow. And so the second motivation was, well, to quote another foresight person, if we always do what we have always done, we will get what we've always got. And that was a little bit the type of questions that at the International Training Center we're dealing with in 42 different areas of expertise requires a little bit of what Marius called system thinking. If I talk about labor migration, informal economy, the different things under climate change, probably we will need different approaches to address these type of wicked challenges. So that was, let's say, the third motivation. And then maybe the last one, I mean, we're always talking about disruption and change in light of the pandemic, but disruption and change has been there all the time. That uncertainty was the only certainty. So also for our senior management, we said like, well, when the rate of change is happening so big beyond the organization, and when that would one be bigger than the rate of the change inside, then the end is near. So we put innovation across our, let's say, institutional mandate. And foresight was the kind of, I mean, you had a very nice recap today of where we are in the course. We've used it also in these kind of different stages. We used some of these methodologies to get a grip on the complexity of the context out there. We bring the diversity of actors together to have discussions, and then jointly, I mean, this kind of, I would call it threefold. Things diverge, then actually some patterns emerge, and then together you envision different futures on a particular topic. I want to share with you three things out there that we have done and that we also will share in the light of this course. The first one was that was 5 years ago. I think we've built ourselves a foresight toolkit because we have seen that, I mean, not everybody we are here with 180 people. Of them, not all of them are foresight experts. So we wanted to make that a little bit more accessible. Now we bundled, I think, a group of 16 different methodologies out there. Some of them I've seen in the recap, thinking about 3 horizons, wind tunneling, causal layered analysis, they're out there. And we did a little bit the same trajectory of the School of the International Futures. When you're in that scoping type of elements, you also are asking, why are we going to do what we do? Is it now that we want to create a little bit of awareness, or do we want to reframe some of our questions? Or is it part of alternative futures that we want to create? Or is there a new strategy ongoing? So in function of, let's say, the overall objective, which is also connected with assumptions, we're going to pick a few methods. What I like also what Mario said, we're also not married with one method. So there's not the 1, 2, 3, 4 steps thing. The reality is much more complex. What we do is basically gather with a very diverse group of stakeholders with different interests, different agendas, and bring them together. The picture that you see here was actually a grouping of diverse stakeholders that came together in Cairo 4 years ago. They were basically reflecting on, let's say, the future of youth employment in North Africa, to make it already really specific. And during 3 days, basically combining a different set of, I think, 5 or 6 different foresight methodologies that you have heard in function of a flow. First diverge, some patterns emerge, and then we came up with a few scenarios that give light. What was interesting for us, and also the lessons learned, that the manual was for us a first step. It made it accessible for practitioners. They could go into conversation with partners that they not always talk to, and it gave them a kind of a common ground to create a shared desired future. One of the things we've learned, I mean, there's plenty of foresight toolkits out there. I mean, you would also get lost in the amount of different, let's say, methodologies out there. We said we need to go one step further, and that brought us to another toolkit, which we will share, because some of the practitioners said, like, look, if you want to discuss about the future, it cannot only be merely, let's say, conceptual. We need to make futures tangible. We need to make them visible. So we developed not only 3 pages on how to apply basically a method, but also practical artifacts on how you currently can co-create and shape futures. When Marius was thinking about the steep card set, you know, on the 5 different categories, we thought very interesting for us, but we really want to contextualize that. So we basically shaped about 180 different signals into a card set, because one of our first reflections on when we were doing Foresight, okay, they're mapping the drivers, but often it's stuck into a kind of a shallow conversation. Yeah, climate change is an important driver. And then we wanted to make sure that they went really to the nitty-gritty, concrete, different elements. So these 180 cards, I have here one of them with me. They don't talk only about climate change, but they have 20 different subcategories, talking from biodiversity towards urban agriculture, that give us a really concrete picture. And for these tools, these artifacts helped us into the Foresight discussions kind of a lot, not only with the cards, but every other methodology we'll find in there with very concrete collective templates, so that when people had the instructions to go into a dialogue, they had also a step-by-step things that they had to build and to construct. And even in the end coming up with, let's say, very concrete things. This is like a kind of a result of the future of work, what kind of future jobs would be in there, that we almost went into design fiction, trying to imagine what that kind of future would actually look like. And that brought us to the 3rd project and the last one that I want to share, because still in pandemic, we usually do these kind of Foresight labs. They are extremely immersive, not only theoretical or you're really together with people, not only rationally, but also emotionally empathic. You're building together a kind of a future. And so when the pandemic hit, we said, oh, are we going to do this now to a series of webinars? Can that replace, let's say, basically what we did before in our immersive labs? That was actually an important design question for us. So we asked ourselves the question, how can we enhance the Foresight learning experience through virtual reality? And that's what we currently are doing with a project which is called Future Fields. And the interesting thing is that we applied our own Foresight thinking on how do we actually run Foresight workshops. And so here you see our director into a kind of Oculus Quest headset element. And the big changes here is that you're not separated by screen, but we basically started to think, how can these very interesting methodologies that also Marius was talking about can be transformed into almost virtual architecture. What you see here is, for example, the wind tunneling, which is also one of the methodologies. We said, instead of discussing the different trends out there, what if we build really a tunnel in VR and let the groups actually walk through it while they actually are discussing the different elements? Or another one, when you do the steep cards, instead of just talking about the different signals that are out there, walk into this kind of platform, and there are about 180 different drawers that you can open where you can pick out the different signals. And what we have learned out of that, that for the first time we had again a kind of an immersive experience where we also were feeling together, but where we also were building futures in 3-dimensional ways. And so these are, let's say, 3 projects. Of course, as a training center, we focus a bit on, let's say, the methodology and the facilitation type of elements, but it was only through really starting with it, experimenting with it. And what you're seeing here is like actually the end day of our future fields, where we bring all these senior ILO officials together in what a future city would look like. And then the results of their Foresight lab are presented into a 1-hour city walk through actually virtual reality. This is not science fiction. It's really happening right now at the level of one specific UN agency. We're starting now with another one. And as always, for me, like Foresight, it's not you're starting here with a very interesting course that we're doing, but see it as, you know, the start of a kind of a journey. Because for me, Foresight has always been as a kind of a muscle, something that you need to train. And often when you start, the results might not only be wildcards, but things that are unexpectedly come to your plate. That's why I use this final quote to close my testimonial here. Experience is the hardest kind of teacher. It gives you the test first and the lesson afterwards. So in a nutshell, 3 projects, 3 toolkits, which we will give you access to. And I think also look through these kind of toolkits, surf to navigate through it and see how, you know, it could be used for your own project that you're now also shaping up. Johan, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I wonder if we have time probably for one question. So is there anybody who wants to ask Tom an additional question? This has been very fascinating. Thank you. You're talking about experimentation and also the participatory approaches, really touching on artifacts, which we haven't really dealt with in the program so far, and experiential futures, which is really interesting. Anybody who wants to ask Tom a question? Tom, I think they're immersed in the links that Delphine added to the chat, possibly.
Yeah, I will also, I mean, these are the links that tell the stories about it, but if someone would have the need for the templates or the exercises, we also can share it. But I see that there's a hand raising from Minji. Minji, go ahead.
Hi. This is Minji. Sorry, I'm not turning on my camera. I work for the Innovation Cell of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. So fascinating, Tom, and nice to meet you. My question is on really the kind of the work that you've done, which is quite speculative. It's also using new technologies. It's an amalgamation of many things. What kind of significant change have you seen in the policy sphere?
Yeah. Now, actually, it's a very relevant question out there, because you're not only, and you saw my last story, you're not only combining Foresight, which was for a lot of people already something new, you're also combining it with virtual reality, which was also something new for people, and then putting it together in, actually, we've integrated that in the ILO leadership type of program. I must say, honestly, what I've seen when I look through our innovation facilities, and I look on how they're now actually, when they run meetings or when they actually do workshops, that there's already, let's say, a full embracement of some of the more standard methodologies that also Marius was explaining about. We've run plenty of these kind of Foresight labs, and actually also Marius mentioned what you can do in 3 or 5 days is extremely limited. It's kind of an awareness raising. To give you the first example that I was sharing with you here on this one, where we actually were working in Cairo, North Africa, Future of Youth Employment. That 5-day workshop got such an interest with actually parties that before were not really on speaking terms, by way of speaking. And rightly after, they have ordered, because they were extremely interesting in the horizon scanning, that also would require more resources. And actually they started that project then right after kind of it. So in a way that would then also lead towards, let's say, potential policy change. What I also see is that there's no linear relationship between, you know, I'm going to do a Foresight lab that would aim to, but there's a lot of serendipity happening out of it. We have seen that with our virtual reality thing that we're doing. Suddenly the adoption of new technologies among senior management was not an issue anymore, but that was not actually a direct consequence or intention of what we wanted to do. That just popped up. And I think it's with this kind of open spirit, not linear, but just engaging into also complex setting ups, because I can really assure you that this one here, engaging in an immersive thing, was extremely challenging in terms of setting it up. Again, to answer on your question, do you map out what kind of policies have changed? I would say for us, it's always the kind of impact question, being a training center, where is the direct correlation between, let's say, your workshop or your lab and then the final policy change. There's so many other factors in there that contribute. So we are actually concentrating now, let's go beyond the workshop factory. Let's create a kind of an engaging environment where people are not afraid anymore to embrace these kind of, let's say, methods where uncertainty is a key driver and not just a technical solution to the problems that they're having. And let's build that community through experiments, through innovation, so that it becomes bigger. That when we introduce the next time a new kind of element, there's immediately a kind of adoption, and not only adoption by the early adopters, but that Foresight becomes a kind of integrated intellectual muscle from all the people that are working with us. So again, not a certainty answer on your question here, but more a kind of a movement that we're trying to nourish within, let's say, the larger institutional community. Back to you, Johan.
Thank you, Tom. Let me just go back to the screen. Great, and I hope you can see what I'm sharing. Thank you very much. So next up, we've got Daria Verschai. She's one of my colleagues, and she's from Slovenia. She also recently, and congratulations, recently received her doctorate on user involvement in the smart mobility transition in the Netherlands. Congratulations to you, Daria. And you will be presenting to us about the future of adolescent mental health in the UK, which was one of our projects. And the big question here was what changes in the urban environment might impact adolescent mental health in 2035. And I'm going to stop screen share so that you can continue. You're welcome, Daria, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Johan. I will just share my screen. I hope this is working for everyone. Lovely to be here. Good to see everyone. I think some of you might have met me already as I was supporting facilitation for some of the breakout groups. So as Johan mentioned, I will present briefly one of the projects that I've been working on together with our colleague, Andrew Curry. And the project was about the future of adolescents' mental health for Guy's and St. Thomas's charity, one of the oldest charities in the UK. And basically the purpose was to map future changes or challenges that will impact adolescent mental health in 2 boroughs of London. And so I've underlined the 2 boroughs of London because basically those are very specific in terms of having the highest percentage of BAME, so Black, Asian, and minority ethnics. I know that this definition might be controversial for some, but it's just the one that I'm going for. It's the most recent one that the UK government is using. And basically they're specific in many different ways. One of them being, for example, that they are less likely to report mental health issues, that they have higher rates of poverty. And we've discovered, for example, that, you know, not having being raised in a cold house or not having enough food and things like that have significant impacts on mental health care. So it was very important to focus on those 2, on the characteristics of those 2 specific boroughs. And that also impacted the scoping question, basically, that Johan already mentioned. So we had to make sure to involve those. In terms of design considerations, it was quite a short project that lasted around 2 months. So it needed a quick turnaround. It was also during the time when the first COVID lockdown started. And so the workshops had to be online. And as you probably know, SWAF has quite a bit of experience and is a network organization, so has quite a lot of experience in delivering virtual workshops. However, the clients are not perhaps so used to it. So we had to do a bit more reassurance and making sure that the client and everyone, participants, are sort of comfortable with that. And the other thing that is important to mention is that getting the right information from the 2 specific boroughs in London proved to be a bit tricky. However, there were a lot of subject matter experts in the house who knew the issues around, you know, the healthcare system, around adolescent mental health, and those specific kind of characteristics in those specific regions quite well. And that helped us significantly in terms of getting the relevant data out of the workshops and in terms of ensuring that we can actually complete the project in such a kind of a fairly short timeline. I think that's about enough about the context. And so I would like to talk to you a bit about the specific methodologies that we used. Basically, there were three stages. One of them was scanning for drivers of change, then research workshop with partners, who I mentioned, partners being people either directly working in the charity itself, so for our client, or for their kind of partners who they collaborate with quite often. And then the third stage was analysis and domains development. And so to be a bit more specific, basically, we developed a deck of around 55 drivers across the STEEP categories of social, technological, economic, environmental, political, plus values. Plus we added a specific category relating to the health sector. And so we scanned for that. Then we organized a workshop and we asked the participants to identify from the full list of drivers of change, a short list of drivers that they consider would have a significant impact on our scoping question. And so they then explained the type of impact that they see for each of the shortlisted drivers. And through a dialogue process, basically in the workshop, we identified connections between these high impact drivers as well as other drivers in the kind of in the deck. And so this helped us to identify kind of major themes or the domains. And so the domains were developed in an inductive process. And I am not sure how familiar this approach is. So I will just say a couple of words about that. It's basically, it's an approach to identify significant fields for a system or for a sector. And so the domain analysis seeks to identify, basically, it's obvious, it's kind of a simplification, but it's focused in the systems approach. And it also draws on the idea of the cone of uncertainty. And basically the cone model shows that the range of uncertainty increases over time, although the speed of change is regulated by slow moving and contextual drivers. And so if you take the different domains together, I will show a diagram a bit later. If you take the different domains together, normally around 5 to 6 emerge, then you get a futures landscape. And it's just important to know because I assume everyone is quite familiar with scenarios and the domains differ in the sense that they may conflict with one another. So there can be a couple of them kind of happening and impacting one another. And I'll show you the outcomes that came out of it, but just briefly kind of to tell you the key outcomes that came out of it, not methodologically, but basically strategically that the client was then able to use, was we realized that the early intervention is really needed. Like I mentioned earlier, like in the first 3 years or so of child's life, a lot of decisions have already been made about how their mental health is going to evolve. So those early stages are really important. And it's also very important to intervene and to offer solutions early on when the mental health issues have been identified. Furthermore, we've also identified that it's important for the charity to focus on how to improve routes into mental health to support children of youth and color, because we mentioned there are some cultural differences. As we mentioned earlier, they might not be taking mental health issues seriously, or they might not be reporting it. So it's very important to get that connection. A couple of additional important things. It was very important that schools play a key role in terms of supporting mental health of adolescents, in terms of offering school meals, in terms of offering extracurricular activities, just offering overall kind of a safe space to support children and their well-being. We're also wondering, the UK has a history of having youth clubs where the youth could actually go for different extracurricular activities. And we've seen kind of decrease of those recently. And we're thinking that it would be a good idea to actually reimagine those and the future of those to, again, offer another safe space to the youth, perhaps those who are not doing so well in school or who just need another space. And the final idea was to redesign the public spaces that are safe for youth together in collaboration with the youth and to get them a bit more involved and in basically governance of cities overall. Now, going back into the methodology, this is an example of a driver that we've produced, basically taken from our driver stack. We've kind of taken 3 to 5 sources, which we included in the notes. Then you see the title, kind of the subtitle, explaining the directionality of the trend. On the right side, you see kind of an image or a quote supporting the data. Then we would include 2 to 3 paragraphs summarizing the evidence. in one paragraph, and one paragraph that would kind of provide counter data. Of course, that's not always easy to find, but if useful, it adds another kind of level or nuance. And what I'm showing now are example of domains. There are going to be, I think, 4 different slides. So the first one is an introduction, a couple of images again, supporting the data, just quickly indicating what we're talking about, and then looking at the domain, what the transition is. So we are moving from traditionally organized and institutionalized force of CAMS, which means, which is relating to the offering services for mental health. I don't remember the complete abbreviation. So moving from traditionally organized and institutionalized form to more distributed forms. For example, you see an iPhone as a therapist. So a lot of the services will be moving online, and increasingly so during the time we were conducting the research when COVID had started. And then what is important here, or specifically interesting, is how each of the different domains can be presented in terms of different loops that can be reinforcing one another or also going against each other. And basically we've mapped the different drivers around each of the 2 loops, kind of put what we think is in the middle of it, and kind of added a bit of story or what we need, what we think should happen in order to kind of support the main kind of changes captured in the middle. And then we've just summarized that with a bit of text, added again some data points, supporting insight, and perhaps what was of most value for the client, issues and implications, and so specifically kind of policy and research questions that they can then further explore. And that was particularly important because it was kind of a short project, so we didn't have the time to get into all of this. And here you can see what I was talking about earlier, how the domains come together to kind of form a future landscape. And it was important to look into health, but not only that, we've realized that, you know, education, home, community have very important, are kind of important spaces where well-being, which have an impact on well-being, and where kind of just impact mental well-being significantly, especially of adolescents. So that's it from my side.
Daria, thank you very much. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions, and while people are asking, one question we have for you, actually from us internally, is this something we can share as examples to and make some of these links available? Is it possible? Okay, so we'll just follow up and make that possible. Thank you so much. Any questions? I think we've got a minute or so quickly for questions for Daria. We want to keep up with the lineup and have enough time for everybody to present, but is there any questions about this? It doesn't seem like that. So Daria, many thanks from our end. It's a great example of a project, and also how you included systems thinking into that. Maybe just one quick question. The domains, you use that to build scenarios. And in other words, did the domains differ in terms of how they were described for each scenario?
Sorry?
Can you just tell a little bit more about how you use the domains in terms of scenario creation?
Yes, so I guess the process was fairly similar in the sense that we started with, you know, kind of identifying themes from drivers in a workshop in a very collaborative way. And then we went through the process of kind of refining the themes on our own. And I think what was interesting was that we had these different kind of spaces that are interacting with one another and kind of together having an impact on one's mental well-being. And so the domains approach seemed a bit more useful because, as I said, scenarios can often be seen as distinct stories, whereas the domains can have an impact on one another. So it was just made sense to go for that approach and to build them together once we knew what kind of the key factors and the key domains are that would have an impact.
Thank you so much. That's really a great example. Thinking differently about it. And Marius also added in the chat, trends, themes, domains. Great. Thank you so much, Daria.
Thank you. Bye. Enjoy the rest of the session.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome if you have to go. Then next up we have Aline Roldan. And Aline, thank you for waiting. Aline is a Foresight practitioner, an urban planner, and a capacity development expert at UNOSAT. And she's in Thailand at this moment. She's also one of our Next Generation Foresight Practitioner awardees in 2018. She won the award for South America, and that was about the project she's going to talk about now, Foresight at the Margins, and it was a 7-year effort to understand what a community-led foresight means in practice and in theory. Aline, I'm going to stop sharing. We're glad to have you here. And do you want to drive the slides? Let's see if that's possible.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Well, there you go.
Can you see my slide?
Not yet, but I'm sure it will. There we go. Yes, thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really happy to be here. And I want to start my presentation with the quote that Tom ended his presentation, that experience is the hardest kind of teacher. It gives you the test first and the lesson afterwards. So this my presentation will be about my experience in Foresight during these 7 years. And pretty much when I was doing the experience, a lot of the experience I could not understand fully. And then it took me, after 5 years working in informal settlements, I'm going to explain the experience in a minute, took me 3 years to try to learn from that experience and understand what that meant, what is Foresight in the context of communities that are marginalized. Because I think one thing is like when we're doing Foresight with people that are in a position of power. And another thing is to do Foresight when you are in a position with people that are in a position of trauma or trauma created by poverty or violence. So these are very different contexts, and you need to be aware of that. So I think I will share a little bit the things that I learned in that experience that was very, very challenging. So our purpose was very ambitious, was to make an empowerment process. So if you think about a question was how to create a bottom-up local development process based on the community dreams for their future. So I don't know if you have heard that saying, I think in Brazil is very, very famous, I'm from Brazil, is that I give a man a fish and he will eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he will eat for a lifetime. So we had that phrase, me and my colleagues at that time, like in 2015, and we wanted to go a step further and say, okay, you are not giving the fish. We are not giving the fishing rod. You want to do a step backwards and say, okay, what people want to eat. So what if we start a local development process, not thinking about solving a problem, but standing together in a very respectful way with the community to understand what they want for their future. And based on that understanding, we can work together to implement their dreams for the future, right? So we have a very basic approach. That's basically, okay, we do a participatory action research. We arrive in the community and you have this main question to people: what's your dream? What do you want for the community? What do you want for yourself? And the idea, I cannot see it. Can you see my, the last question here? Okay, that's fine. So the idea is this: through this dialogue, we would open up a space of possibility, a space of we can be together, build trust. And once trust is established, we can visualize different futures. Once you visualize something different, we can implement. But of course, I'm making things way simpler than they were because the process was way messier. Just to give a concrete example, here you see in the left, in the right or left, I don't know if it's mirrored, the Jardim Perialto was a community that part of that was informal settlement, part of that of low-income neighborhood. And basically they didn't have a neighborhood association at that time. And slowly we started building, we arrived with a group of volunteers from the university. We had connections with a local nonprofit organization. And then slowly we built connections with the people in the neighborhood. And then we started a planning process. We identified that they wanted to create a neighborhood association. And then together we started to support them to create that neighborhood association. And the neighborhood association after that made a lot of things for the community. For example, they wanted a neighborhood, a community without trash, without waste on the streets. So they managed to for example, get the support from the government to bring waste trucks to collect the waste, and was 7 trucks of waste, for example, in one of the actions. They organized festivals and so on. So this is another example. Through this Foresight, people would realize, wait, we can do something together, and they would implement what they wanted. So that was the principle. The method, at that time, what we understood that we were doing was participatory action research. Basically, that was you listen, you plan, you act, you listen again and learn from the process, you act again, and so on. So it's not a linear process, it's more like a spiral or loops. And what I can see that, for example, many times the community, when you would arrive, first you need to establish trust, right? The second is there's a lot of not believing that it will be possible to do something, or not visualizing, or not oh, who are these people? Why are you going to believe that you're going to do something together? So these little actions, sometimes not so big, like this dragon that you see, we built with the community. These small actions of seeing the possibility that something could be different in the community would build hope, and open people's imagination to think, oh, actually we can do something different, we can do something else. And as Tom said, this is a muscle, right? Imagination is a muscle, foresight is a muscle, it's activating a muscle. So people were we would train this muscle to people through small actions to start to believe that something different was possible. And then you would make it happen. So these are some other examples, very simple strategies that you used, using photographs to help to wake up people's imagination about what would be possible. Asking children who are very open to talk about their dreams and draw, etc. That was a very different reality from adults. I can tell more about that if you want, but this is another example here. So basically we have this process of revitalizing a public square. Basically, it was not a public square, it was a terrain abandoned for 30 years or so. With the community, we managed to, through this process here, we managed after we built trust, to think together what they wanted for the public square. Then at some point, the public square, we had a conflict with the government. The government destroyed everything that we built with the community. That created a big political tension, and that led the government and the community to build a partnership together and actually do a proper project for this public square and implement that project. So this is another example that foresight, when you're talking about foresight with the purpose of local development, of empowerment, is not a linear process. Is not a process that's detached from political processes. You cannot think that outside of power. You need to. There's no way to think about foresight without understanding the power dynamics of the community and the power dynamics within the foresight methods that we're using. So, and also conflict, it was a big catalyzer to build a dream together later, right? So these are some other examples that you used. These are many methodologies about social theater for people to imagine dreams through their bodies, but also a lot of other tools from participatory action research. Because when you're talking, I think a very important thing to highlight here, when you're talking about foresight, about communities helping, not helping, but being together with somebody else to dream about a future, if they don't have the perception that they deserve a different future, or they can, of what this kind of different future could be, there's a blockage in the imagination, let's say. If you don't believe that something can be different, how are going to imagine something different? So a lot of the process was to help people to be visible to themselves and build this trust, this relationship that, okay, something can be different. And then the future, after that process, that social process, the future could be, let's say, visible and emerge. Otherwise, many people, for example, would say, especially adults, I don't have a dream. I don't believe that anything can be different in the community. I don't believe that some people would say, I need to be born again to have a different life. Nothing can change. So that was a very strong pattern. And that led to my research later doing my master's about what does it mean to talk about imagination in the context of urban planning. So, but I not talk about that right now. So another thing about talking about imagination in the context of communities is about that needs to be gender and age sensitive. Doing a process with children about foresight is different than doing with adults, and is also different from doing with mixed groups like adults and teenagers and children, etc. They have very different approaches to their own imagination. It's very interesting. And also you have, inside of the community, you have all these groups and religions and age. So you need to fit the method according to the context, right? For example, and also you need to create the space for people to imagine. You need to bring the invitation for people to imagine to spaces that they are. So you see here in the left is an example of collecting children's dreams, that you would be there. And the idea that you have a suite in Brazil that's called Dream. So we would exchange a dream for a dream. And the children would come and say, what's your dream? And they will write in the post-it, etc., and put there. In the right side, we have here people preparing their resume in the community. So that would be a way to help them to understand what they want for their future and what you could do to help, and how their individual future was connected with the community future too. So, I showed before what we thought that we were doing, but after my master thesis, I researched the imagination, the context of a grassroots movement in Brazil that basically they have the challenge of making people believe that they can have a house when they're homeless and engage them in the movement, making them to feel that they have a right to housing. So after that research and reflecting by my own experience in Brazil, what I think that it summarizes when you're this discussion about how to have foresight with communities is that you need to think about three things. You need to think about three simultaneous processes that are happening at the same time, of making people visible to themselves. If you don't believe that you can have something different, it's really hard to imagine something different. Making territories visible. If you don't think that you belong to a place, or you want to be in a place, or you are connected with other people in that place, in that territory, why you are going to dream something about that place, right? So, and then futures can be visible from the moment that you have an individual or a community in dialogue, existing together and thinking about their space, you know? So this framework is not a methodology, it's more like a framework to think about what a community-based foresight process is. And the outcome of this effort was basically what I believe was that there's this tangible dimension of the waste. They could implement a project about waste. They could create a neighborhood association that varied according to the context. But I think the main outcome, the main contribution was to help people to build a sense that they have a right. We have a right and you have a voice. We have not as a right as an abstract notion, a human right, but having the embodied experience that I deserve to have something, and we are able to implement this. So I think that's the link. I think this potential of foresight to help build this perception to be a holder of a right. I have a dream, therefore I have a right, right? So about lessons learned, I think I probably my time is over and sorry, but very quickly, lessons learned, we are doing like, I think my main the thing that I learned the most is that you need to think about foresight as a social process. When you're talking about communities, it's not the collection of planning sessions or events. It's about a social process that making people, territories, and futures visible. And again, these other points I have already mentioned, but foresight in communities means to activate people's capacity to imagine. What I would have done different, tons of things. Well, we committed so many mistakes. And we learn it from them. Sometimes we just reflected about them too late. But I think if I would have done something different, would be that you need to, we have a stronger focus on producing foresight artifacts throughout the visual, because video, movies, films have an extremely powerful, at least in Brazilian favelas, informal settlements, they had a huge power to put people together, to make people see each other, to make people see something different. So creating like this kind of artifacts that people could visualize themselves, their community, their territories, and different futures visually, I think that would be very powerful in the small experiences that we had. And finally, for sure, stronger linkage with policy and planning process, with grassroots movements, mapping and data to have more like connect this bottom-up process with larger planning process that are going on. I'll stop here and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that we may have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Aline. And as I said, people are welcome. Please just check the chat because we will not have time for question and answers. But if you want to ask Aline any questions, please do there. She will respond, and we will also give ways for you to link up with her. Next up in 8 minutes, or maybe 9, because Pupil, I know you also have another call after this, is Pupil Bisht. She's in New York currently. She's a multidisciplinary designer and futurist. She was our main award winner in 2018 for the NGFP Awards. And her focus is on decolonizing futures, exploring storytelling as a tool for inclusion in foresight. And I'm not going to talk anymore because the time is little. So Pupil, I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Johan. Hello, everyone. Hope you've been enjoying the session so far. I'm going to get right into it. If I can just get a thumbs up from you, Johan, that you're able to see my slides. Excellent. So thank you so much, Eleni. I feel like you've made my job much easier because a lot of the dilemmas, the challenges around working directly with communities and doing foresight work, the kind of power dynamics that we need to bring into question when we're doing this work to ensure that we're not creating more harm. By, despite our best intentions. Aline has already covered a lot of those nuances, so which means I can focus on the other bits. So the way Johan already introduced me, I am the founder of Decolonizing Futures Initiative, and that is what I was hoping to speak to you about today. But in order to speak about that initiative, I need to sort of go back in time a little bit and speak about a moment in my life when the initiative and this work really started taking its roots. So I actually did my master's in foresight at Wildcard University in Toronto. I'm originally from India. And I think my experience of studying foresight in Canada as an international student coming from a culture like India, previously colonized country, was a very, very interesting one. And I realized during my time of studying foresight that despite talking about futures, and we're told always in plural, we are actually somehow subconsciously committed to building very, very singular, monochromatic images of this time that is yet to come. And how do we do that, you may ask? We do that by mostly reproducing dominant ideas, values, and worldviews, really, in all of our foresight work. And sometimes this is intentional. So a lot of the times it's tacit and it's unintentional. But when we do that without challenging these latent assumptions and biases and prejudices in foresight work, what we end up doing is we perpetuate the marginalization of those who do not fit this image. So a lot of my time as a student of foresight was actually spent on examining the contemporary methods toolkit. And upon examination, I realized that so many of our methods continue to carry values from the discipline's industrial and militaristic past. We still talk of the future as a distant, unknown land that we can map our ways to. And this is actually an extremely colonial trope. Instead, I encourage you all to think of the future as a space that we're all co-creating in real time. And therefore, we need to exercise a lot of care and responsibility as we co-create together. Also, a lot of the methods actually have an extremely logical, scientific, deductive, and expert-led approach to knowledge creation. There is an implicit, imposed idea of time, space, and progress. Oftentimes, time is visualized extremely linearly. And this is actually an extremely limited and singular way of thinking about the world, thinking about time and space, thinking about the future that a lot of cultures, my culture included, actually don't align with. So when we're practicing foresight like that, we're really leaving out all the cultures who don't think about the world similarly. So the question that my initiative was really responding to was, how can we use local knowledge systems, histories, conceptions of time and space as alternate ways of thinking about the future? And therefore, for me, addressing the glaring lack of methods shaped by non-Western ways of knowing, being, and doing that I noticed in the practice became an extremely urgent task. And I knew that this is the way for us to start bringing in local philosophies and traditions that have been marginalized or ignored so far. So with that in mind, as a response to those research questions, I designed and initiated the Decolonizing Futures Initiative. My initiative utilizes a really unique folk storytelling tradition from Rajasthan, India, called Kavar. And I use that as a tool for inclusion of marginalized voices and cultural knowledge in futures work. And the method, the initiative, the spaces that I facilitate as part of it are really explicitly and specifically designed to place the power of both story making and storytelling directly in the hands of my participating communities, so that we're actually walking the talk on, supporting an inclusive and pluralistic exploration of preferred futures. So this is kind of what the method looks like. The inspiration that I drew from the Kavar tradition in Rajasthan, it actually has a really rich history of inclusion that I unfortunately don't have the time to speak about, but it was designed 400 years ago in an extremely caste segregated part of India to facilitate patron communities that belong to marginalized castes to actually perform religious pilgrimage. So it was an act of rebellion that led to the inception of the storytelling tradition. So when I designed my method, I actually modeled the 10 steps of time travel that we take in the workshop together on those 10 steps of pilgrimage that are part of the folk storytelling tradition structure. And of course, when I won the NGFP award for this methodological innovation, I really got this unique opportunity that most research students don't get, is to actually take my thesis out for a walk from my university's library and bring it to life in the real world, as we say. So for me, the question in piloting all of this work became, how do I use something like this and actually build the capacity and capability of local communities to collectively imagine the futures that they desire? And a lot of barriers that Aline already spoke about were barriers that I saw as well. So very, very quickly, these are a few communities that I worked with all over the world, really, even though my pilot was more formally situated in India. So the first one that you see is actually from Canada, where I worked with a network of BIPOC grassroots youth organizers from across Canada, a lot of whom were actually Indigenous youth from remote Canadian provinces. And the question that we explored through the cover was, what would it mean for them to collectively heal from colonial trauma over the next 30 years? And what would those healed futures and journeys towards them actually look like? The second one that you see is actually with 50 high school students from around the world who use the cover as a personal exploration tool to really think about the really young kids who are now growing into young adults, and they use the cover to imagine individual personal futures and who do they want to embody 25 years from now, and what would their role be in that future? What you see at the bottom is me working with women from rural West Africa who were in India getting trained to become solar engineers, actually. And through the workshop, the question that they were exploring is, what would it actually mean for women in rural communities all over the world to reinterpret their traditional role as caretakers of nature by actually localizing sustainable technologies that could continue to benefit their future generations. So, and then I've done a lot of work with middle school and high school students in India, specifically girl children, because their perspective is the one that's most ignored within the current infrastructures. So you might be wondering why any of this is important, or as I would like to say, is actually quite urgent, is because we can talk all we want about leaving no one behind, but none of that is actually going to be possible until we accept and acknowledge that futures for all cannot and should not be imagined by a few. So that is the fundamental philosophy that I think is part of a participatory futures approach to decision making. It centers the voices and lived experiences of the communities that were actually, whose futures we're actually seeking to improve. And I had the honor of speaking at Anga this past year with Kat. And we were discussing our common agenda. And in that, Honorable Secretary General actually talks about the fact that we're at this inflection point, right, in our shared history. And business as usual is the path to destruction and breakdown. But I truly believe that a breakthrough can be achieved as far as we're willing to put our efforts towards opening up the future, really looking at it as a common public good. And I truly believe that taking participatory futures approaches is one of the only way forwards that gives us any real chance to walk the talk, as I said, on leaving no one behind. And oftentimes institutions and governments think that this work is embellishment or it's just a point on a checklist, and that it detracts us from other urgent, more pressing challenges. But I actually think that this approach to decision making and policy making is actually a very unique, practical way of complex place-based problem solving, something that's completely missing from a lot of our toolkits. And most importantly, it's a great way of creating a sense of ownership in citizens over a shared vision of the future. And that's really needed if you want to socialize bold policies and inspire collective action towards meeting the 2030 agenda. So I'm definitely over time. I'm going to pause here and thank you, Johan, for asking me to share.
Pupil, great. Thank you so much. There is probably a minute if anybody wants to add questions. It's always fascinating to listen to you, and also the way in which you opened up Foresight to, moving it away from the Western assumptions and methodologies to really have everybody take ownership of this. So thank you so much for this, Pupil. Just one or two comments quickly in terms of we'll make sure that we can also get you in contact with some of the speakers if you wish. So when we have a newsletter, Pupil, if you don't mind, we'll share some of your and Aline's output as well as Tom and from Daria. And then this is very illustrative in terms of mixed methods approaches. If we see, Pupil, what you have done in Aline versus the more technical systems approach Daria had in her project, it illustrates the way the broad diversity of Foresight uses and different methods we can string together for different purposes. And I think what it demonstrates is, as Claudia also rightly said, it's an opportunity for us all to really become Foresight advocates, since the future really affects us all. So that's very well put. So thank you so much for being here and presenting, Pupil. And then just for everybody, next steps. And with that, then we close. Next steps is Thursday's learning session. The learning group will focus on designing my Foresight experiment. Where there will be more time for questions and answers in terms of helping you along with designing your experiment. Now that we've gone through all the methods, or not all the methods, but had a sample of what is possible and what can be done. And Marius, Claudia, is there anything I'm missing before we close the session? Feel free to comment.
One comment from me, Johan, and that is to say that was an absolutely jam-packed session with such brilliant insights. Just another thank you to the speakers and for your great work putting that session together. Colleagues, thank you for a great discussion and session, and we look forward to connecting with you on Thursday. Have a lovely week and great seeing you as always.